It was an ordinary Thursday afternoon, the kind where the sun hit the floor just right and everything felt still. I was reheating leftover soup in the microwave, the kind Dad used to tease me about. You can build bridges but can't cook soup. I smiled at the memory, then my phone lit up. A message from my cousin. Your siblings are at the will reading. Thought you'd be there. I blinked, reread it. The spoon slipped from my hand and clattered in the sink. No one had told me. Not a call, not a text. Nothing. My heart sank. Not because of the will, but because they had gathered in that room and chosen not to see me as part of this family. They sat there, dividing up the man who raised us, while pretending I didn't exist. For a moment, I felt that old ache again, the kind that starts in your chest and spreads like cold water in your veins. I wasn't angry. Not yet. Just erased. Like all the nights I stayed late with Dad at the hospital didn't count. Like I was never the one who fixed the roof, paid the bills when he got sick, or held his hand when no one else showed up. But here's the thing. While they were busy making speeches and counting what they thought they'd inherited, I was holding on to something they'd overlooked. A truth buried in old papers, in deeds they thought no one cared to check. And once I stepped into that silence, they left me in. I didn't come back empty-handed. I'm Lauren, the daughter they forgot, on purpose. But I don't need their seat at the table. I brought my own chair, along with the truth. If you've ever been cast aside, I think you'll want to hear this. I was in the middle of reviewing zoning overlays for a new waterfront project when the call came through. Unknown number. I almost declined it. Meetings were back-to-back all day, but something made me pick up. Is this Ms. Lauren Price? The voice on the other end asked. I confirmed, and then came the pause. The kind of pause that only ever precedes bad news. I'm calling from the office of Monroe and Cole, attorneys at law. I'm sorry to inform you that your father, Mr. Harlan Price, passed away yesterday morning in Austin. For 10 years, I'd trained myself not to flinch at the mention of his name. And yet, in that sterile silence that followed, I felt the floor tilt beneath me. My father was gone. The man who had raised me taught me how to read site plans before I was 10, and then later stood by while I was quietly erased from everything that used to be ours. An hour later, I opened my inbox. A new email sat unread. From Bethany Carter, my childhood best friend, the only tie I had left to Austin. Lauren, I thought you should know. The will's being read this Friday. You're not on the list. Just that. No fluff, no apology, no shock in her words. Like somehow, this had been expected. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling of my tiny office. 10 years ago, my father had married Delilah, a socialite with a rehearsed smile and 2 perfect children, Reed and June. At first, she'd played the sweet stepmother act. Then, the company meetings started excluding me. Design proposals I'd written disappeared from the board agenda. My name faded from conversations, and eventually, from his life. When I left Austin, it wasn't in protest. It was in surrender. But this was different. It wasn't about money. I'd built a solid life in Seattle. I had my own apartment, clients who respected me, work that mattered. I didn't need Price Holdings or whatever was left of it. What hurt was something deeper, that I no longer existed in the story of my own family, that my father's final act, at least on paper, was to pretend I was never there. For the first time in years, I opened the box of things I'd kept from home. Inside, next to old sketches and photos, was a small wooden box, mahogany, hand-carved. On the bottom, in my father's scrawl, was a code, 6 digits. I knew instantly what it was: the old safe at his workbench, buried in the garage behind the Austin house. Next to it, taped carefully to the lid, was a small worn key. It had a faded Cadillac emblem on it. I hadn't driven that car since college. The pain was old, but sharp, like a healed bone suddenly aching before a storm. I closed the box slowly, then stood and stared out at the Seattle skyline. Glass towers, order. A city that had never known the version of me left behind in Austin. I didn't need the inheritance, but I needed to know if he remembered me. And so, I booked a flight back to Texas. Not to claim what was mine, but to reclaim who I was. And maybe, just maybe, to finish a conversation my father never had the courage to start. The sun hit different in Austin. Not like Seattle's gray whispers, but a bold, unfiltered blaze that made the air feel heavier, like everything you tried to forget might rise up and slap you across the face. I stood outside the rusted gate of my grandfather's house, a place I hadn't seen since I was 25, freshly disowned and still foolishly clinging to the hope that silence meant my father would come find me. The old place was nearly unchanged. Peeling paint, ivy crawling along the stone, but it still smelled like home, cedar, and warm dust. I let myself in with the spare key hidden behind the gutter, stepped past the creaky screen door, and found the workbench in the back room. It took only seconds to punch in the 6-digit code etched on the bottom of the wooden box. The safe popped open with a hiss of stale air and memory. Inside was a thick folder marked with my mother's name, Ruth Price. I hadn't spoken her name aloud in years. She died when I was 15, long before Delilah entered our lives. There were land title documents, property surveys, and a neatly bound trust deed, all filed under the Ruth Foundation. My father's signature appeared again and again, his unmistakable scrawl, dated just 3 months before his health had declined. There were even transfer slips, moving assets from Price Holdings into the foundation. So, the man who cut me out of his will had quietly built a fund in my mother's name, assigned directly to her foundation, and not a single word about it in the official records. My fingers shook as I turned the pages. Whoever had crafted the will being read this week clearly omitted the most valuable part of his estate. And not by accident. I didn't know where to start, but I remembered a name, Sylvia Tran. She had been my father's longtime legal counsel on real estate transactions. If there was anyone who could tell me whether these documents were real, it was her. She agreed to meet that afternoon in a modest office tucked behind a bookstore on Congress Avenue. Sylvia was sharp as ever, silver-gray streaks in her black hair, tortoiseshell glasses, a no-nonsense demeanor that could cut glass. She took one look at the documents and nodded. These are legitimate, and your father was careful. He separated the foundation assets entirely from Price Holdings before his last hospitalization. Which means, she said, tapping the folder, these lands are not governed by his will. They're held in a private trust. Whoever drafted that will left this out either by ignorance or intention. I sat back, exhaling. So, technically, the land is still protected? In theory, but that doesn't mean someone isn't trying to sell it. That sentence rang like a warning bell. I checked my phone, opened an email Bethany had forwarded me earlier, part of a public zoning notice about an upcoming property development deal. A corporation named Crescent Capital was set to close on a land acquisition in East Austin. I zoomed into the attached parcel map. It was the same land listed in the Ruth Foundation's assets. Reed. I didn't even need to guess. It had his fingerprints all over it. He was Delilah's golden boy, entitled, manipulative, and completely unaware of boundaries. I remembered overhearing him once as a teenager bragging about owning half of Austin by 30. Now, apparently, he was selling off the part that never belonged to him. I called Sylvia. If the sale goes through, you'll have a lawsuit on your hands. But by then, it'll be messy. International buyers, contract breach, and likely irreversible damage to the land's zoning. My fingers tightened around the edge of the folder. I hadn't come back to fight. I'd come for closure. But now, something much larger was at stake. My mother's name, my father's silent redemption, and everything they had both tried to leave behind for something better. I thought about disappearing again, letting it all fall apart, walking away before the scars reopened. But that folder in my hands, that was proof. That was trust. Quiet and buried, but never broken. I knew what I had to do. The will reading was set for Friday morning at the Price family estate. I wasn't on the guest list, but I was going anyway, not just to crash the reading, but to stop the theft. And this time, I wouldn't be leaving quietly. The room was far too polished for the kind of truth that was about to hit it. Leather chairs lined a long mahogany table, polished to a blinding shine. At the head sat Delilah, dressed in a pearl gray suit, her blonde hair swept into a tight chignon. On either side of her were Reed and June, both trying to look important. Though Reed radiated the kind of smugness only inherited wealth, or the illusion of it, could afford. A few of the old board members of Price Holdings lingered at the corners, faces stiff, eyes darting like they'd rather be anywhere else. The lawyer cleared his throat. This reading pertains to the final will and testament of Mr. Harlan Price. The document names Delilah Price as surviving spouse, as executor. Delilah smiled coolly and cut him off with a practiced hand gesture. Let's not draw it out. The estate, including all associated assets of Price Holdings, the East Side developments, and corporate holdings, will be passed down to myself, and subsequently to my children, Reed and June. She clasped her hands with a sense of theatrical finality, like a queen confirming the line of succession. The lawyer looked mildly uncomfortable but nodded. That is correct, per the document submitted 3 months prior to Mr. Price's passing. Reed leaned back, already calculating the renovations he'd make to the Austin penthouse. But the doors hadn't even clicked shut behind the last line of the will when they burst open again. I stepped into the room, folder in hand. No grand speech, no announcement. Just footsteps across the tile and the heavy thud of paper hitting wood. Before you finalize anything, I said evenly, you'll want to see this. Gasps rippled. Reed looked like he'd seen a ghost. Delilah's smile twitched at the corner. The lawyer reached for the folder as I slid it toward him. Original land titles, a notarized letter from the bank confirming active trust holdings under the Ruth Foundation, and a survey map clearly marking the parcels under protection. This trust, I said, was established by Harlan Price and transferred separately from the main estate. These assets aren't part of the will because they don't belong to it. They're in the name of my mother, Ruth Price, for the benefit of her descendants. Delilah opened her mouth, likely to unleash a carefully rehearsed denial, but the door opened again. This time, it was Sylvia. She walked in calmly, set down a separate envelope, and addressed the room. I represent the interests of the Ruth Foundation, she said. This is a supplemental testament, recorded 6 weeks before Mr. Price's passing. Video included. The lawyer popped open the file on his laptop. Harlan appeared on the screen, gray-haired, frail, but unmistakably lucid. If you're watching this, his voice crackled, I've passed. And if Lauren's in that room, it means she's finally home. I failed her. But I didn't forget her. The foundation, the land, that's for her. Not out of guilt, but out of truth. You could have heard a pin drop. Then came the storm. Reed stood, knocking over his chair. This is manipulation. He was sick. This video doesn't mean anything. The documents aren't even... That's enough, June said quietly. Everyone turned. She'd barely spoken the whole meeting. But now she stood, pale and shaking, holding something in her hands. It's real, she said, voice wavering. I found this last week in Dad's study. She handed me a worn leather journal, I opened it. My father's handwriting, looping, sharp, desperate. Page after page of entries detailing meetings with Sylvia, property transfers, and private notes. In one entry, he wrote, "She won't take my calls. But maybe, one day, she'll see I never stopped believing in her. Maybe this land can speak where I never could." Tears burned behind my eyes, but I blinked them back. This wasn't the time. Delilah's face had hardened into a mask of disbelief and something that looked like fear. She opened her mouth to object again, but there was nothing left to say. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Given the video, the supplemental testament, and supporting documents, I'll be seeking judicial verification. The original will is now legally in question." I stood quietly. "I didn't come here to beg for a piece of anything," I said. "I came for what was entrusted to me. That's all." And with that, I turned and walked out, leaving behind the silence, the shame, and the stunned eyes of people who once believed I'd stay gone forever. I moved into Bethany's guest room with a suitcase and a storm. Her place was a modest craftsman-style home tucked into East Austin. Nothing fancy, but every corner felt lived in. It was the kind of space that welcomed tired hearts without asking questions. Bethany hadn't changed. Still sharp-tongued, still half-married to her next exposé. We hadn't spoken in years, but the second I showed up on her porch, she hugged me like no time had passed. "Let me guess," she said, arms crossed as she handed me a cup of coffee. "Delilah didn't expect you to still have teeth." "Or a backbone," I muttered. Over the next few days, I told her everything: the trust, the land, the plan I found among my father's old notes. His dream of converting the East Side property into public green space, affordable housing, a school named after my mother. He called it Price Commons, a place for legacy, not wealth, but belonging. Bethany listened, her brow furrowed, her fingers already flying over her laptop. "I've heard whispers about a fast-track development permit in that district, but it wasn't through City Hall. If someone's doing backdoor deals, it's dirty." She dug. She always had been relentless when it came to the truth. And sure enough, 2 days later, she found it. Dunes Capital, a shadowy Dubai-based holding group known for wiping neighborhoods clean for luxury developments. They had a contract pending, set to acquire a majority of the East Side block, including parcels under the Ruth Foundation Trust. The kicker? The clause buried deep in the contract, forced relocation of all current residents within 90 days of construction approval. Even worse, Delilah's name on the consultant authorization. She was orchestrating the whole thing behind everyone's back, including Reed's. "She's feeding him breadcrumbs," Bethany said. "Reed thinks he's running the deal, but your stepmother's holding the strings." We knew we had to move fast. So I did what my father never had the chance to do. I made our vision public. Bethany helped me organize a press conference at the local community center. The place was packed. Neighbors, city council reps, young activists, and curious journalists. I stood behind the podium, palms sweating, voice steadier than I thought possible. "My name is Lauren Price. I'm here not to reclaim what's mine, but to give back what was meant to be shared." I unveiled the plans for Price Commons, renderings of affordable homes, green parks, a rec center, and memorial gardens dedicated to Austin's underserved families. A legally binding framework for full public transparency on how the trust's funds would be used. "The Ruth Foundation," I added, "is not for profit. It is for people." Within an hour, the hashtag #RealPricePlan was trending. By nightfall, the video of my speech had been shared over 100,000 times. Reed panicked, and in his panic, he got sloppy. Bethany published the first in a 5-part series the following morning, "The Deal That Buried Austin." It included leaked emails, forged surveys, and altered zoning forms Reed had submitted. documents now under scrutiny by the City Ethics Board. Then came the hammer blow. The legal department of Price Holdings removed Delilah's authorization to represent the company's interests. Her status was frozen, pending investigation. I didn't smile when I heard the news. I felt tired. Like I'd just put down a weight I didn't know I'd been carrying for 10 years. Later that evening, I was sitting on the porch, nursing tea, when I heard the creak of the gate. June stepped in quietly, hands in her jacket pockets. "I read the articles," she said. "I didn't know half of what they were doing." "I believe you," I said simply. She hesitated. "If you still want to do what Dad started, I'm in. Whatever you need. I want to be part of it. Not for them. For him." And for the first time since stepping foot back in Austin, I didn't feel like I was fighting alone. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about reclaiming a story that had almost been erased. One that didn't belong to Delilah or Reed or the investors salivating over glass towers. It belonged to my father, to Ruth, to this city, and now, to me. Delilah made her exit like a queen stepping down from a collapsing throne. No public apology, no admissions, just a cold press release stating her intent to pursue personal endeavors abroad, and the swift sale of her remaining shares in Price Holdings. Reed, on the other hand, was less ceremonious. He vanished days before a subpoena arrived, his lawyer citing a wellness retreat in the Maldives, though rumor had it he boarded a jet under a different name. Their absence was a vacuum, but not a silent one. Suddenly, I had full control over the lands my father fought to protect, the legal deeds, the public narrative, the future of Price Commons. For the first time in years, no one was standing in my way. But just because the noise outside quieted didn't mean the storm within had passed. The media that once cast me as the forgotten daughter now crowned me as Austin's savior. Lauren Price, the heiress who gave it back. From exile to icon, glossy headlines, flattering photos, clickbait admiration. But the public was never one voice. And beneath the praise, a shadowed murmur grew louder. Talk shows questioned my intentions. Think pieces debated whether I was genuinely altruistic or just rebranding pain into PR. Is Price Commons a memorial or a monument to herself? Read one opinion column that went semi-viral. I could have defended myself. Instead, I chose to keep building. Old investors who had once backed my father and then abandoned him resurfaced. They brought polished smiles and portfolios thick with promises. One offered to triple the capital if I'd convert half the commons into mixed-use condos. Another proposed an entertainment complex named after Ruth. I declined all of them. Price Commons wasn't for profit. That was the line I wouldn't cross. We broke ground 2 weeks later. There was no grand fanfare, no velvet ribbon, just a humble wooden arch, a cluster of neighbors, and a brass plaque bolted onto stone that read, "Ruth Price Foundation, land for people, not power." I gave a short speech, just long enough to say what mattered. Bethany streamed it live. June stood beside me, holding the community survey forms we'd designed together. She'd taken on the role of community oversight director, ensuring every voice had a seat at the table. Bethany managed press coverage for the project now. She turned down 3 national interviews to stay local. "Truth begins at home," she told me. I think we both understood the story wasn't mine alone to tell anymore. By the end of the month, I moved back into my mother's old house on Trinity Street. It was smaller than I remembered. The paint had faded, the porch swing creaked, and the scent of rosemary still lingered in the backyard garden she used to tend barefoot. The first night I slept there, I sat at the kitchen table long after midnight, staring at the same spot I'd once left from in silence. Back then, I was 17, and everything hurt in a way I didn't have words for. Now, everything still hurt, but the hurt had names, history, and direction. Peace settled in like the last breath before a wave, not final, not fragile, but temporary, because I could feel it. Somewhere beneath the ground we were rebuilding. Tension not yet resolved, chapters not yet written. This was not the end. This was only the pause before the next reckoning. 1 year. That's how long it took to turn an idea into movement, blueprints into community. Price Commons had become more than land. It was a promise. Children played in the unfinished courtyards. Elderly neighbors planted flowers where sidewalks would soon be. We were 3 months from opening Phase 1. I had speaking invites from universities, a profile in Texas Monthly, and a city award sitting half unwrapped on my desk. Then, one morning, it hit like a news ticker across a cracked screen. Delilah named CEO of Crescent Capital. Delilah wasn't just back. She'd returned with armor, allies, and a war chest. Crescent Capital was one of the largest real estate conglomerates in the Southwest, and within 2 weeks of her appointment, they announced the acquisition of nearly every parcel of land surrounding Price Commons. Their plan? A luxury complex, glass towers, exclusive retail, a rooftop heliport. Every inch designed to dwarf our project, visually, economically, spiritually. It was an act of calculated suffocation. Then came the legal attack. Delilah's lawyers filed a civil suit claiming I had manipulated Harlan into revising his will during a period of cognitive decline. She accused me of emotional coercion and unethical influence, using phrases like fraudulent benevolence that made me want to vomit. And worst of all, some people believed it. That same week, Crescent's PR machine dredged up Bethany's old blog posts, claiming her coverage was biased and personal. She was suspended from her investigative reporting credentials pending an ethics review. One of our fiercest voices, silenced without a chance to fight back. Then the bombshell dropped in court, a recovered copy of Harlan's previous will. It was aged, scanned, verified with eerie precision. The signature matched. The language was familiar. It claimed Reed was the sole heir. I knew it was fake, but proving it? That would take months, maybe years. The media didn't wait. Heir wars. Who really owns the Price legacy? From hero to heist? They flooded the narrative with doubt. Investors pulled out. A major grant we depended on was suspended pending reputational review. And finally, the city council issued a freeze order, stopping all construction until the legal battle resolved. The Price Commons fell silent overnight. Half-built foundations stood like bones beneath fog. Volunteers stopped coming. Even the kids disappeared. I went back to Ruth's house that night. The air was stale, humid with the kind of quiet that wraps around your ribs. I tried to turn on the light in the kitchen. Nothing. The bulb had burned out days ago, and I hadn't noticed. I stood in the dark, my palm resting against the table where I used to write grant letters, vision plans, birthday cards I never sent. All that remained now was silence, and a sickening sense that everything I'd built was slipping through my fingers. I sat in that darkness for a long time, my hands open and empty in my lap, wondering how many times a legacy could be stolen before it simply disappeared. The morning headlines hit like shrapnel. Fraud or fighter? Engineer turned activist under fire. And worst of all, was Lauren Price ever qualified to build anything? I stepped outside Ruth's old house and was immediately swarmed by reporters. They shouted questions I didn't have answers to, or refused to dignify. Cameras snapped like they were trying to catch me unraveling in real time. One woman shoved a mic inches from my face and asked if I felt ashamed. I didn't respond. That afternoon, a video went viral showing a split screen. One side featured a photo of my dad beaming with Reed and Delilah. The other, A low-quality courtroom sketch of me looking tired and cornered. Underneath, from legacy to liability. The city that once called me a hero was now teetering. Some still sent messages of support. But more and more, I noticed comments asking if this had been about ego all along. The people I once stood beside at City Hall now ghosted my calls. A councilman I'd considered an ally told me off the record to lay low until it blew over. It wasn't blowing over. Then I realized some original documents tied to the land deeds, ones I'd stored in a locked filing cabinet in my father's study, were missing. Not misplaced. Missing. June and I turned the house upside down. Nothing. No sign of forced entry. Just gone. Whoever took them had either been let in or already had a key. I wanted to confront June, but before I could, she came to me first. Her eyes were red, shoulders tight. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Mom told me if I didn't step away from you, she'd cut me off completely. She already called my boss. I have to think about my daughter." She hugged me briefly like she couldn't afford to linger. Then she was gone. I tried to push forward, but days later, Sylvia, my attorney, called in a panic. She'd been served. Delilah's lawyers were now accusing her of conspiring to forge documents in my favor. Her license was at risk. A judge issued an injunction to halt use of the evidence we'd built our case on. Everything was under review. Then came the final blow. A grainy, edited video leaked on social media. It showed my father breathing heavily, slurring a few words in his final weeks. The caption read, "Clearly not of sound mind." Of course, it was out of context. Of course, it was doctored. But once that seed was planted, it grew like mold. The Ruth Foundation's account was frozen. Construction on Price Commons ceased. Contractors walked off. Bills stacked up on the kitchen counter. I called 20 banks in 2 days. No one would touch a project under litigation, and I started to unravel. I found myself awake at 3 a.m., sitting at the edge of my bed staring at nothing. I drank coffee just to feel something. One morning, I drove to the build site and sat in my car for hours, unable to step out. The skeletal frames of future homes stood still, like ghosts of a vision slipping from my grasp. Back at the office, I shut the blinds and turned off my phone. I didn't want to see another notification, didn't want to read another op-ed. I sat alone in the dark conference room, the same place where we'd once planned playgrounds and gardens. Now it was just me, the hum of broken silence, and a sickening feeling that maybe, just maybe, they were right. Maybe I had reached too far. Maybe I wasn't strong enough. Maybe this fight was never mine to win. The air inside my mother's old storage shed was thick with dust and memory. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just some place that felt still, unjudged, untouched by courtrooms or headlines. Somewhere I could breathe without hearing whispers. I found the sewing box under a faded tarp, the one Ruth used to keep buttons and thread in. When I opened it, tucked beneath the lining was a key. A familiar, slightly rusted Cadillac key with a worn leather tag. My father's 1968 Coupe de Ville had been sitting in the garage for years, untouched since his funeral. It was more a monument than a vehicle. No one had ever thought to open it, not even me. I stood in front of the car for a long time, the key trembling slightly in my hand. When I finally slid it into the trunk, it creaked open with a sound that felt like memory cracking. Beneath a layer of tarp and a vintage toolkit, I found a small wooden box. Inside it, wrapped in a thin towel, was an external hard drive. One of those bulky, early 2000s ones. It took me days to restore what was inside. The files were scrambled, and half the software was incompatible. But I wasn't alone. Bethany, suspended from her journalist account but not her instincts, came over every night with coffee and stubbornness. "We've cracked worse," she whispered as she bypassed corrupted file blocks and ran data recovery protocols like a surgeon. On the fourth night, the drive spoke. There were folders dated by hand, emails, voice memos, security cam snapshots from within Price Holdings' private offices, and then, videos. We watched in silence as one showed Delilah in my father's hospital room. She was leaning in, softly coercive, slipping documents in front of him while a nurse adjusted his IV. His eyes were foggy, his voice slurred. She whispered, "Just sign here, Henry. It's all for Lauren anyway." He hesitated, and she gently placed a pen in his hand. Another video showed her and Reed meeting with a man from Crescent Capital in a restaurant booth. A timestamp from 16 months ago. Money transfers, non-disclosure agreements, digital signatures buried under shell companies. It wasn't just shady, it was surgical. But what made me freeze was an unopened folder labeled 4LP. Inside was a letter my father had written, typed, then printed and signed, along with a scanned envelope with my old Austin address. The envelope was stamped, "Returned to sender." Someone in that house had intercepted it. And inside that folder? A scanned copy of the original zoning map, labeled "Final Hand Verified." His fingerprint was smudged on the bottom corner, next to his wet ink signature. Unaltered. Undeniable. I stared at that document for a long time. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from clarity. This wasn't a fight about land anymore. It was about truth that had tried to reach me long ago, but got buried, hijacked, silenced. That night, I took out the old concept board for Price Commons, pinned it up on the living room wall. Sketches, notes in pencil, Ruth's cursive handwriting in the margins, all still there, all still possible. I called Bethany, I called Sylvia, I called the community board. This time, we wouldn't wait for a court to catch up to truth. I organized a public hearing, not to humiliate Delilah, not to seek vengeance, but to make the truth visible. I invited the press, the city council, former donors, skeptics, believers. As I stared at the old board under the lamplight, I whispered, mostly to myself, "This time, I'm not fighting because I've been attacked. I'm standing up because it's right." The community center buzzed like a hive on the morning of the hearing. Folding chairs filled the hall, some occupied by skeptical neighbors, others by loyal supporters, reporters clutching notepads, and city officials with guarded expressions. A line of cameras blinked red, waiting for a moment worth capturing. I stood just off stage, my hands damp and clenched. This wasn't about winning. It was about clearing the fog. When I stepped up to the podium, I didn't start with an accusation. I started with an apology. "I'm sorry," I said, scanning the crowd. "I'm sorry I let uncertainty fester, that I gave silence a chance to grow louder than truth. I owe you not words, but proof. Today, I intend to give you that." Sylvia followed me to the front, steady as ever, and laid out the evidence like a prosecutor in a courtroom. She projected the first document on the screen, a forged deed of transfer, signed under duress. Then the emails, metadata timestamps, correspondence between Delilah and Crescent Capital, complete with side agreements that violated city land use statutes. She played a clip of my father's conversation with his physician, voice faint but clear, discussing the effects of sedatives and his resistance to making legal decisions while under medication. Gasps echoed across the room. Some crossed their arms. Others leaned forward, eyes wide. Then Bethany took the mic. Despite being under suspension, she'd completed a new investigation. She displayed a timeline of bank records, ghost accounts, a list of shell companies routed through digital laundering paths, all pointing back to Delilah's personal assistant and Reed. "This wasn't a misunderstanding," Bethany said, her voice steady. "It was a system built to conceal, to profit, and to displace. But the biggest surprise came when June stepped forward. I hadn't seen her arrive. Her hair was pinned up, her blazer too large for her shoulders, but her voice was sharp. "My mother asked me to forge documents," she said plainly. I refused. "She told me I'd regret choosing loyalty to Lauren. I don't." The room went quiet. "I support Price Commons. I support the truth." You could feel the shift in the air. Then came the crack in the institution itself. Councilman Ramirez, one of the most vocal opponents of Price Commons, hesitated when called to comment. Finally, under pressure, he admitted to receiving campaign donations from Crescent Capital, unreported ones. Audible murmurs swept through the crowd. He was escorted out by Ethics Committee representatives before the hearing even ended. By the time I returned to the podium, I could sense something had changed. I didn't gloat. I didn't name names. "Saying the truth isn't meant to shame," I said, gripping the edge of the lectern. "It's meant to free us. From doubt, from manipulation, from the weight of silence." As the crowd stood and applauded, Sylvia filed a formal civil lawsuit and motioned for a criminal investigation into Delilah, Reed, and the Crescent Capital Board. The cameras caught the moment, but I wasn't looking at the flashbulbs. I was looking at the faces, those who had doubted, now nodding quietly. Not because I'd forced them to believe me, but because the truth had spoken louder than I ever could. A month later, the dust was still settling, but the balance had shifted. Delilah was subpoenaed for financial misconduct. Reed was indicted for conspiracy and fraudulent activity tied to corporate bribery. Crescent Capital was banned from conducting business within the state of Texas pending federal investigation. Their power, once insurmountable, now sat in limbo. But something even more important happened. Quietly, without cameras or fanfare, the City Council reinstated Price Commons building permits. At a press conference on the courthouse steps, they confirmed that the project was, and always had been, legal, transparent, and deeply needed. At a community event later that week, I was handed a plaque, Urban Civic Leadership Award, Lauren Palmer. I held it in both hands, but all I could think about was my mother's apron strings, the smell of paint in her garage, and how she used to say, "Do what lasts." Bethany was also recognized. Her article had gone viral and earned her a regional press award. June stood beside me on stage, part of the restructured design committee for Price Commons. Her face was calm, steady, at peace. That same day, we launched the Ruth Foundation. Its mission was simple: support young women entering architecture and design, especially those from overlooked communities. I watched as the first scholarship was announced. The name read aloud. I imagined Ruth smiling somewhere, probably rolling her eyes at the fuss, but proud nonetheless. Weeks later, I visited a small elementary school the foundation had supported. The classroom was decorated with hand-drawn blueprints, crooked crayons outlining skyscrapers and bridges. A little girl tugged at my sleeve. "Did you do all this because you were mad?" she asked, her eyes bright and unsure. I knelt beside her. "No," I said gently. "I did it because I miss someone who taught me to do the right thing, even when no one else stands with you." That night, I walked through the grounds of Price Commons. The construction had resumed. Frames were up, lights strung across steel beams. I stood on the balcony of what would one day be a community hall, overlooking a future built on truth. The sky stretched wide and open, just like it had that first day I came home. I wasn't surrounded by family in the way I used to imagine, but I wasn't alone either. There were people who chose to believe, who chose to build. And as I looked out over the city, the words came quietly. Some things we lose forever, but some, like truth, just need to be held long enough to bring us home. Sometimes the truth doesn't roar, it waits. It waits in silence, in forgotten papers, in the quiet courage to stand up even when you're standing alone. And when it finally rises, it doesn't seek revenge. It seeks release. Because healing isn't about proving others wrong. It's about remembering who you are when no one else does. If this story stirred something in you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment, follow, or subscribe for more stories that speak the quiet truths so many carry.